Folks, it is Tuesday, August 11th. Welcome back to Cape Ann. Today, each week, Heather Atwood speaks with Senator Bruce Tarr about a bevy of subjects, and she had another great chat with him this past Friday. We're airing it right now for you. Heather, what did the two of you discuss?
Well, we talked about the fact that both the House and the Senate extended the formal sessions, right? It opens with that conversation. There's a lot of reasoning behind it. In the past, the reason why they ended these formal sessions right now is because we're going into election season. And it's going to be sort of interesting to watch how the state legislature manages making some big decisions on some big packages of legislation in election season. But there's a lot more. We get kind of personal. We talk about the big empty state house and how sad that sort of feels. The senator gets poignant about that. It's a really nice conversation. I hope people can listen.
All right, here is Heather with Senator Bruce Tarr.
So Heather, we're seeing some things that are really unusual on Beacon Hill with regard to the schedule. And it's important to understand a couple of different parameters when we talk about the legislative schedule. And one thing that many folks aren't aware of is that under the Constitution, the House and the Senate are required to meet every 72 hours year-round. And most folks aren't aware of that because they'll pick up the newspaper or watch TV and see the legislature is on vacation or in recess. And what those stories and those reports refer to is actually the formal session. And so here's the difference. We still meet regardless every 72 hours, but oftentimes those are in informal sessions. And an informal session is where there aren't any recorded roll call votes. There's very little, if any, debate. And any member of the legislature, if it's the House, any member of the House, and if you're in a Senate session, any member of the Senate can object to any matter being taken up in an informal session. So it's really a tool to be able to deal with routine matters and to be able to dispose of them so that when we're in formal sessions, we take up things that require more bandwidth, like debate and like the recording of votes and things of that nature. And so the rules of the legislature are different than the Constitution. The rules say that formal sessions in the second year of the legislative session, which we're in right now, they end at the end of July. So what would normally be happening right now is that we would be only in informal sessions from now until pretty much the first week of January. And because of the 72-hour requirement, we would usually be meeting on Mondays and Thursdays, and we wouldn't have any formal sessions at all. Now, as a practical matter, that's still going to happen because we are going to meet much more in informal sessions than formal sessions right now. But we did suspend the rules. And the suspension of the rule, that it's Rule 12A, it's a joint rule of the House and the Senate, allows us to come back into a formal session during this extended period of time between the end of July and the first week in January. And the reason that was done, it was, well, actually more than one reason, but one reason was because we lost so much time due to the pandemic that we weren't able to do some of the normal things that we would have done. The second reason is because we may have to address an emergency situation as a result of the pandemic, and we didn't want to have our hands tied so that we couldn't come into a formal session. Now, a lot of the things that deal with the pandemic, we actually have been doing in informal session, and we'll continue to do that. But there could be that rare instance where we need to come in and deal with an emergency where we need a formal session. And I can tell you, in my time in the legislature, I've almost never seen this rule suspended. In most every instance, it's been a situation where we end at the end of July. So this year's a little bit different. And there's a couple of big things that I think would cause us to come back in. Number one, we know we don't have a state budget yet. We're operating on an interim budget, and that's going to carry us through October, but we don't have a budget for the rest of the fiscal year that we're currently in. And as we've talked about a few times, and I don't want to be redundant, but we're waiting for the federal government to see what they're going to do to be able to provide assistance to the states. And we're also looking carefully at tax collection information. So we had postponed the income tax filing deadline to the middle of July, and we're now looking to see, we have a full month of reporting in for July to see what our revenue looks like, And so we're going to follow up on that. So we definitely will have to come in and do a budget. And then we also have several conference committees meeting right now. And a conference committee occurs when the House and the Senate pass similar bills on the same subject, but because of their differences, a committee gets appointed of 3 members of the House and 3 members of the Senate to negotiate and reconcile those into a final bill. And right now we have those conference committees meeting on police reform, transportation, healthcare, and climate change and energy, as well as economic development. So if there is a reconciliation on any one of those, I suspect that we'll come in a formal session to take those up.
And you had hoped to finish all those very big pieces of legislation by July 31st.
We definitely did. And I think if this were a normal year where we didn't have a rule suspension, some of those bills simply would have died and needed to be taken up in the new year. But because of these unusual circumstances, there is a chance, and I certainly hope, that on many of these items that we actually do get resolution. In fact, it would be good to get resolution on all of them. And I'm hoping that that will be the case.
So you are on the police, working on the conference committee for the police reform bill. What is it like? I assume that you are working on this committee by Zoom. And have you ever done anything like that before? And what does that feel like?
So the first thing I have to say is that the committee is now meeting in executive session. And so we originally met in a public session. It was on Zoom. And then a vote was made to close the hearing and the meetings to the public and go into an executive session. I actually opposed that vote, and I voted to keep the session open. But because the vote was successful, I really can't talk too much about the details of what's happening. But I can tell you that we are meeting by Zoom. We are meeting virtually, and it's a very intense discussion, as you might imagine. And it's one where I think 6 very well-intentioned, reasoned people are wrestling to try to find the right path on something that is very, very important to our Commonwealth.
No, I understood that you weren't able to talk about it, but could you just talk a little bit about, first of all, you've been in the State House almost by yourself for this whole session, right? I mean, what has that felt like? And now you're working in conference committee, remotely. What does this whole experience feel like for you?
Well, it's in a place that is hard to describe because I've never experienced it before. So just to give you a sense, just about every day I'm here at the State House, and I have a skeleton staff here with me. Usually it's 3 members of the staff. Everyone else is working from home and working very hard, I might add. We're all in touch using electronic technology, but it's a much different atmosphere when you can't walk down the hall and talk to a colleague, or you don't have an informal gathering maybe of a few people to try to resolve an issue in a way that you can't necessarily do it electronically. So it's a much, much different environment. And to have a conference committee that can only meet essentially through electronic technology, through Zoom, it's a very different thing. And it's particularly a different thing when we're talking about something that brings such strong emotion and such strong passion. And electronic technology is wonderful, but it doesn't always convey that interpersonal sense. And so, for instance, I know that my colleagues on the conference committee are extremely committed to what we're talking about. So I don't need to have to be in person for that. But sometimes someone's inflection or their tone can be misinterpreted. And so it is helpful when you can meet on a personal level, and that just isn't happening. And in fact, I was on a leadership call just a little while ago with the governor and the speaker and the Senate President, and we were all talking about the fact that a lot of what happens in the legislature oftentimes happens with those sort of informal communications when people bounce ideas off each other or try to get a sense of where someone's coming from. And right now, that's a very difficult thing to do. And one of the things that I've started to do a little bit, and I'm going to let you in on one of my secrets here, Heather, is that I've been a little bit concerned about being on Zoom calls throughout the day and not getting as much exercise as I should.
Oh,
and
we all have that problem.
It is a serious thing, and I don't feel good about it. But one of the things that I've been doing is after 5 o'clock, when a lot of the calls for the day stop and before the ones for the evening start, I will put my earbuds in and stream some classical music over the phone and walk around the floors of the State House. And a few nights ago, I was thinking, it is so unusual to have this incredibly important symbolic building not be open to the public. And the likelihood is that it won't be open to the public, and it won't be open for regular business for the foreseeable future. And that is a really difficult thing to be able to comprehend. But it is the reality of the situation that we're in.
That's really poignant and very real. Yeah, it really says everything, right? The people's house is empty.
It is incredibly poignant that, you know, we're here conducting public business, and one of the things that we always hold very sacred is that when public business is being transacted, the public has a right to be present. And so, for instance, right now there can't be anybody in the galleries of the House or the Senate, which are reserved for public observation. There can't be a meeting in anyone's office. There can't be a meeting in the hallway. And if you were here and you walked around the State House, you would see that there are very, very few people actually in the building.
Well, to that point, I think Madam President has been in the chamber with you, right, all along. And I actually heard her talking about being worried about the senators. And apparently she started something called the buddy system.
Yes.
So do you want to describe that? I mean, she said, I was a dead mother once, and I'm worried about everyone. And so how do you think the senators are holding up? They have their own trials with their families and their family's health and, you know, their constituents. And tell us about the buddy system.
So the president and I discussed this very frequently. In fact, we had a discussion about it this afternoon, and about how difficult it is to continue to operate the Senate and the State House without being able to have people present, and how difficult it is, particularly in session, where members may want to be in the chamber, but they're being discouraged from being in the chamber so as to reduce the number of people concentrated into that one part of the State House. So the buddy system was something that the Senate President came up with very early on at the outbreak of the pandemic. And the idea was that senators are all going through their individual trials, as you mentioned, and all dealing with different things, and some of those things are the same and some of them are different. For instance, we are all spending a lot of time trying to help constituents deal with things like unemployment insurance and making sure that they can make a successful claim. And then other situations are different. So for instance, we right now are heavily engaged in discussion about Amendment 23 that requires at-sea monitors on commercial fishing vessels. And that's important to those of us that represent fishing ports, but maybe not as much to someone in the Berkshires. And folks in the Berkshires are trying to deal with issues of tourism, which is an important part of the economy, but they're not seeing it as much as they might otherwise see it. So the buddy system was just a way to say, at least once a week, we're going to make sure that everyone has a personal contact. And then the buddies of, I am one of those. And so we each have a number of senators, somewhere between 4 and 7 senators that we reach out to. And then the buddies all communicate once a week to talk about what our buddies that we've been calling, what's on their mind and what their concerns are. And that way, we all are having this conversation about what we're going through in a way that's efficient and I would say effective, because we want to make sure that everybody knows that there's support there for them. If they have an issue they need help with, that we're there to be helpful. But at a very, very personal and human level, just to know that there's support there for all of us as we go through these challenging times.
Because you can't bump into each other in the hall and have that sort of conversation and check in with people.
Exactly.
Right.
And the good thing about the buddy system is it guarantees that you're going to hear from somebody at least once a week. And oftentimes it's more than that. And then we all talk about what some of the common concerns are, and we can address them. And those may range from what's happening in session and how we could do better at social distancing or making sure there's sanitizer, or how we might better facilitate conversations about a particular issue. Because one of the other things that the Senate President did that I think has been extremely useful was to develop Senate working groups on particular issues. And so, as we've talked about a little bit in the past, I lead the group on supply chain issues and price gouging. And so we've been spending a lot of our time dealing initially with trying to source and distribute personal protective equipment, but right now we're spending a lot of time on food resources and trying to see if we can capture some possibilities in Massachusetts to increase poultry and meat processing so that we have a locally sourced availability of those kind of things that we might not otherwise have. And obviously we're also looking at the fishing industry, and we've talked about this a little bit about how we're trying to stand up a major new initiative relative to consumer-based seafood processing so that we can shift a little bit from providing the product that's caught locally just to restaurants to be able to provide it to consumers in a consumer-friendly way. And so those working groups are all dealing with different matters, subject matters, but it enables us to focus on specific priorities, but still work together as a team. So one of the things that I'm most pleased by is that the Senate, in this very difficult time, has found a way to set up infrastructure to help us deal with the challenges that we face and to do it in an effective way.
Yeah, it seems really smart. It was good forward thinking there at the beginning of this pandemic. So that was the Mass Seafood Collaborative you were talking about, right?
Correct. Yes.
Yeah. How's that going? I haven't been able to find anyone to talk to me about it except you.
Well, we're working on some people other than me to talk to about that. But it's going really well. In fact, one of the significant things that's happening is that CARES Act money is about to be distributed. And we saw some of that money already go out the door for some of the party and charter boat category and for folks in aquaculture. But the lion's share of the money is actually going to go to harvesters, fishing vessels and their crew, and to processors. And we're hoping that a lot of the money that's going to go to processors is going to be able to be used to retool to be able to produce the kind of products I just described. It's not required for that. It's meant to compensate for losses. But a lot of the processors that we're talking to are saying the best way to compensate for those losses is to be able to invest in a redirection of our effort so that we can earn revenue for however long the situation happens, and maybe for the foreseeable future, because we're opening up new marketing channels.
That is very exciting. So, and we may even talk to somebody else from that group besides you, but we still love hearing from you about this. So you're always so enthusiastic about it. It's great.
It's very exciting. I mean, as you know, I've been involved with supporting the commercial fishing industry for decades. And Representative Ferranti has as well, and Mayor Romeo-Taken has also. And so for all of us to be working on something that is opening up new frontiers is very exciting. And it's unfortunate that we're having to endure a pandemic to be able to get to that point. But it would be more unfortunate if we were enduring the pandemic and not looking at these hopeful horizons as a place to go to.
Yeah, it is really very exciting, I have to say. So before we jump to the governor, anything else in the Senate that we should know about in this?
Well, I would just say that there's a lot of concern about what the federal government is going to do right now. We are all trying to gather as much intelligence as we can in terms of the negotiations between the House and the Senate and the White House. And the one thing that's critical for us is trying to make sure that in whatever package gets developed, there is assistance for the states. Because as we've talked about before, we're looking at a budget deficit that's going to be somewhere between $6 and $8 billion. And we have an incredibly strong stabilization fund, but it only has $3.5 billion. So the deficit is roughly twice the amount of our stabilization fund. So without federal assistance, the budget is going to look very, very different than it will with federal assistance. So we're all looking at Washington and trying to get daily reports. I have a member of my staff that spends a good part of his day just trying to understand what the news is coming out of our nation's capital. And that is a huge issue. And that being said, the other thing that's significant legislatively is we now have had a ratcheted down level of activity, but we still remain engaged and ready to take further action on some of the subjects I described. And that will happen, again, through the first week of the new year, because the legislative session actually goes into the first week of the new year, and that's when we swear in a new legislature.
Right, after that election.
Yeah.
So I have a question about the governor, and I know you have an announcement to make there, but he apparently is part of the executive committee for the National Governors Association, and they just met. And I understand that the chair, Governor Cuomo from New York, had sort of set the table saying that the reformation of this group need to readdress the relationship between the state and federal government. He sort of set the table as that. Now, what do you think about that, given the situation you've trying to manage, this state from your position? Do you want to comment on that?
Sure. And first of all, I'm glad that Governor Cuomo brought that up. And I know that our governor, Governor Baker, speaks to Governor Cuomo quite frequently, as he does the rest of the governors in our part of the country. And our governor actually also speaks to the federal government quite frequently. He had mentioned to me this afternoon that he's had several conversations with members of the U.S. Senate in the last 10 days, as well as members of the House, not only from Massachusetts, but from other states as well. And one of the things for me that the pandemic has done has been introducing a stress test on the institutions of government that we depend on. And clearly, we are in an unprecedented situation. And so we're encountering things that there isn't necessarily a manual for, and we're all trying to figure it out as we go. But one of those things is what the relationship should be between the federal and state governments. And that has so many different dimensions. So for instance, one dimension is public health regulation. And there's been some discussion of should there be a national standard for the wearing of masks or things of that nature. Another one is for public health guidelines from the CDC. Should those govern, or should it be the local, state, in our case, Department of Public Health? So on the regulatory side, there's a whole set of issues. But then there's another issue with regard to funding. And so you've heard, for instance, the debate about testing and how much funding or actual test kits should be made available by the federal government, or whether the states should be on their own to have to go out and purchase them. Same issue arose with regard to ventilators and trying to create what amounts to a national strategic stockpile of them. And where I think we really saw this in an acute way was with the issue of personal protective equipment, where we saw the federal government in some cases in competition with the states for things that both of them needed. And so it begs the question of what is the right configuration to be able to procure those things and to make sure that everybody has what they need. And as I mentioned, I lead the Senate group, the working group on supply chain issues, and we had to troubleshoot more than a couple of cases where people were expecting personal protective equipment and it got intercepted at the port of entry by U.S. Customs to go somewhere else. And so when you're in a situation like this, you need to make sure that whatever acquisition and distribution system you have has integrity and everybody knows what the rules are. And I think we've got a long way to go to figure that out. And so I think there should be a conversation. I think it's going to be a long conversation. I think it needs to be about how in these kinds of situations we're going to work with each other. And there are certainly plenty of examples. And so if we look at other kinds of natural disasters, if we look at a hurricane or a tornado or a winter storm, we know the interaction between the Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA, and the states, in our case through MEMA, the Massachusetts Emergency Management Agency. There's a pretty clear set of rules that govern those relationships. So it isn't that we can't develop a system, because for those kinds of things we have one. But we need to do better at understanding the roles and responsibilities of the various levels of government in the pandemic. And I would say that that also is true with the relationship between municipalities and the state. So for instance, there are some folks that are saying that the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education should issue one blanket set of guidance about what's going to happen in our schools. That's not what's happening now. The individual school committees are coming up with their policies. And there's always that give and take about making sure that decisions are made closest to the people that affect them, but also trying to make sure there's some element of standardization so that we can have the same result across the state. So I think these are really important conversations.
I think this pandemic has exposed a lot of stress spots. So I think you've that's a good way to put it. These are the stress points that we need to reevaluate now.
Well, and I'll just highlight one more for you, and this is something that I've been working on for a long time, as have many of my colleagues, is the situation relative to skilled nursing facilities in Massachusetts. They were already stressed before the pandemic, and they were having difficulty recruiting and retaining staff and being able to maintain quality care because of low rates of reimbursement. And you had a lot of staff people having to work at multiple facilities, moving from one to the other during the day. And of course, when you have the onset of a pandemic, that's the last thing you want. And so it really has been a stress test for our skilled nursing facilities, among so many other things. And that's why we cannot ignore the lessons to be learned from what we are going through, because we've had a tremendous amount of human suffering and tragedy and death and loss and inconvenience and hardship. But at the same time, as we're paying a high price for those things, we need to learn from them, and we need to do the best we can to do better.
Very true. So lastly, there is an announcement by the governor that you were going to let us know about.
And it will be taking effect as we are on the air. So on Tuesday, the governor has made an announcement that the rules relative to public gatherings are changing. And that is reflective of a tremendous concern on Beacon Hill about the uptick in cases, positive cases of COVID-19. Now, it isn't that we're seeing a spike, but we're seeing a creep back up, and that has a lot of people concerned. And when the COVID Command Center and the governor and lieutenant governor looked at the data, what they saw was that the increase is being driven primarily by social gatherings. And so the newest order reduces the number of people that can be at a gathering. And actually, I have it here because I want to make sure I get it right. So here it is. Okay. And it's as we're talking, it's hot off the press. By the time folks are watching us, it will be becoming effective. But essentially what it says is that indoor gatherings are now going to be reduced back to 25 people maximum. And of course, there are percentages, so 8 persons per 1,000 square feet. And then outdoor gatherings would be 8 persons per 1,000 square feet and never more than 50 persons. And so, reduction in the amount of people that can be at these gatherings, and also a re-emphasis on making sure that people are wearing masks, and also an exception for gatherings for political expression and religious activities. And so this is something that I'm sure will be out there. We're going to post it on our social media so that people can see it, and I'm sure it will be posted in many different places, but this really is a sign of the concern that people have. And one of the other things that's happened is a pronouncement that stage 2 of phase 3 is going to be postponed indefinitely. And so we're in stage 1 right now, and a lot of us have been anticipating going to stage 2, but that's not going to happen for a while until we can be sure that public health can be protected.
And it sounds as if this is not about restaurants opening so much. It
really isn't. In fact, I've had the opportunity to discuss that with the governor and lieutenant governor directly, and their indication was that if people are going into a restaurant, they're wearing their mask when they're not eating, and they're following the guidelines of social distancing, and everybody's using hand sanitizer, that really isn't the problem. Right. It's much more a situation, and we've seen this reported in the news, where house parties and other kinds of gatherings have happened. I know there was one football training camp, for instance, that happened that was unauthorized. Those kinds of things where people are in close proximity to each other and are not following the social distancing guidelines, those are the things that seem to be causing the increase in transmission and the increase in the count of positive cases. So really, it's important to understand that the restaurants that have been following the rules are not the source of concern here.
No, I think we could all probably see some casualness about this in our daily lives these days. Well, anything else for us this week, Senator?
Well, I would just say that it's been a long time that we've been having to deal with this, and I think naturally sometimes our guard gets let down, particularly with the good numbers we've seen in Massachusetts. But we don't have to look very far to see what happens when you let your guard down in terms of other parts of the country. So I hope that we'll continue to lead the nation with the way that we deal with this, and I'm thankful every day for the way that we do deal with it. In terms of other things, Heather, we'll be looking very carefully next week to see if any of the conference committees return a report, and whether or not the legislature will be taking up some of those conference committee reports. We'll also be following the budget very carefully to see what's going to happen with that. And a lot of us will be spending a lot of our time looking south to Washington to see what may or may not happen there, because it's critically important. And the last thing I want to do is give a shout out. I was very, very enthused last night to watch the virtual production of the Annisquam Village Players. This is the first summer in many that I will not be joining the members of the AVP on stage in Annisquam, and I missed that a lot.
I know they missed you.
It was so uplifting last night to be able to watch their virtual production, and it's on YouTube, so I believe that anybody can still watch it. And I don't know how long it'll be up. I'm assuming for quite a while. And but just a big thank you to Terry Sands and Mary Curtis and the whole crew over at AVP. I miss them all. But if you want to have a little bit of a lift in your spirits as we go through the pandemic and as we see some storm clouds gathering, I encourage everyone to watch that production, because it will give you that.
Great. On that note, a little summer theater, musical theater. We'll leave with that. Thank you so much. And we'll see you next Friday.
Thanks, Heather. I look forward to it. And well, I'll say have a great weekend, but by the time we're on the air, I hope you will have had a great weekend.
Same to you. Same to you.
Thank you.
All right. Take care.
Take care. Bye.